almost everyone in every culture in the world has some form of love of nature, and really, if they had their preference, would prefer to have a world which had the biodiversity which they have grown accustomed to it. And most of the rationale for biodiversity conservation historically has been based on that kind of argument. Nature is nice to have, and so we should protect it. There is a second set of arguments which I would call ethical arguments, which really, trace themselves to this issue of we have an obligation of stewardship to the world, for no other reason than what right does a current generation have of denying future generations the option of using biodiversity, and that's been a very powerful argument historically as well. There's a new argument which has come up just in the last decade or two, and is sometimes characterized as a utilitarian argument, which is that the reason that we're concerned about biodiversity is actually for selfish reasons, because biodiversity underpins a series of things called ecosystem services, which all of us depend on whether we realize it or not. So essentially all of our provisioning services, things like food and fiber and water, are underpinned by having healthy ecosystems, and they're underpinned by having biodiversity in them. Outbreaks of pests and diseases are controlled by biodiversity, and many of the things that we require for either aesthetic or spiritual reasons are also based on biodiversity. So one of the reasons that one of the contributing factors to the issue of managing the increased rate of biodiversity loss is incomplete information. On the right is a list of biodiversity indicators that was drawn up by the Convention on Biological Diversity as ways that they would like to measure progress towards this target of reducing the rate of biodiversity loss. And the ones in green, the little green feathers I think they are the ones that we actually have in hand. The ones in orange are work in progress, and the ones in red, nothing's been started on. So you can see that even after, a decade of work, there's still a lot of bits there which are either in orange or in red. And so there's been a global movement towards creating a monitoring system to basically take the pulse of nature. And this goes beyond biodiversity. It was a realization at the World Summit that if the nations of the world had to collaborate to manage the planet consistently and collectively, one of the key things that you have to have is shared information. Without shared information, you can't do anything. And so out of that, a process called the Group on Earth Observation came, which was a high-level international discussion group which in time formed itself into an organization, an international organization, whose action plan is this thing called GEOS, the Global Earth Observation System of Systems. And one component of GEOS has to do with the biodiversity observations, and that formed something called the Biodiversity Observation Network, which is what I will talk about for the rest of the little discussion. So this is more or less the timeline of what happened. And I would like to point out that the area of biodiversity informatics has a life of its own other than what's going on within the geosphere. There's been a whole lot of organizations actually collecting biodiversity information sometimes for centuries. And this has become increasingly and spontaneously digitized, and a great deal of advances have been made on making that information interoperable. There's literally hundreds of organizations involved in this area. I'd like to just highlight two. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature has been very active in monitoring biodiversity over a long period of time. And more recently, something called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which pulls together particularly information from museums and herbaria to try and work out where in the world things occur and how do we know what we've got. But anyway, coming out of the World Summit, there was the initial GEO discussions, and really quite rapidly, as for those of you who are used to the glacial pace of international negotiations, this thing called the Group on Earth Observation was formed, and it published its action plan called GEOS, and then a series of discussions began with stakeholders around biodiversity data, and that went through a couple of iterations to the point where the implementation plan for the Geo Biodiversity Observation Network was published just a month ago. And it sets out to basically coordinate the provision of biodiversity information in such a way that it meets the needs of management of biodiversity and the reduction of biodiversity loss. So here's something of a wiring diagram of the sorts of things that we need. And it looks very, very complicated. It is quite complicated because biodiversity data has very many aspects to it, and the uses of it are really quite diverse. And so putting this all together is quite a jigsaw puzzle, but it's not quite as scary once we understand that very large chunks of that are already in progress by a whole variety of organizations who've taken pieces of that. There are still some missing bits. And the key thing that's required at this stage is not so much the boxes. We have information around lots of those boxes. It's the connections. It's getting the interoperability. It's getting the communication between these data sets so that we can interrogate them in different ways. And there are some key missing bits which we really haven't started on yet, and that's one of the things that we'll have to do over the next decade or so, including understanding interactions and understanding biologically what's linked to what. It's not the diversity of things that matters so much as the diversity of ways in which they interact. That determines the stability of ecosystems. It determines how diseases propagate through the world. It determines very many things. We also need to understand biodiversity information at scales well above the species, and particularly at the community and ecosystem scale. And we need to understand how biodiversity impacts on human life. Those are all key areas that need to be part of this puzzle. And particularly for this audience, how do we actually link these three key domains of biodiversity together? Many of us think of biodiversity as being simply about the richness of species. How many species do I have at a place? But in fact, there's much more to biodiversity than that. We think of it as occurring at three levels. The fundamental one is the genetic level, where all biodiversity is based on the variety of genes. But then we also have this phenomenon of species and where they occur in the world and what abundances they occur in. But really the things that matter to us in terms of our own survival are delivered at the ecosystem level, these ecosystem services. So we've got these three levels of biodiversity. How do we get the information on those, which is currently completely separate, to speak to each other? Well, the species name, the little tag which scientists put on a species, is a key way of connecting, but in fact, that by itself is inadequate. We are having to invent these things called persistence identifiers because, as I pointed out, we only know about 1.6 million of the species on Earth. We don't know those very well, incidentally. We think that they might be an order of magnitude more than that. They don't have names yet. They've never been described. So we have to have these persistent identifiers that go around with them. What you will also notice is that location and time, in other words, geographical and time stamping, is a key connector in some areas, but it's not sufficient by itself. So, for instance, just that because some things are co-located does not mean that they function together. It doesn't mean that they're part of the same ecosystem at all. So we have to add to this simply co-registration in time and space a whole lot of other things to help us understand how to link this all together. But I think that there's light at the end of the tunnel. You know, I believe that it's possible. I have a hypothesis that there are essentially only three types of fundamental biodiversity data record. And, you know, the big breakthrough in my mind in human evolution wasn't the moment when one of our ancestors stood upright, or even the moment when they learned to make a stone tool, but the moment when they learned to use syntactic language. Because it was the invention of syntax which allowed us to move from having a very limited repertoire of grunts and howls into being able to string together language in an infinite variety of ways. And it's the same with data in general and biodiversity data in particular. If we know the syntax, we can actually rearrange this information in an infinite variety of ways.